Good morning, everyone. My name is Simon Rodriguez. I'm from South Texas College, and it's my pleasure to be a moderator for this session. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, and our presenter is going to be Matt Silverman. If you're familiar with Matt and his work, then what I'm about to say is something you've known, and we all appreciate about the gentleman. If you don't know Matt, let me give you a little intro and tell you a little bit about him. Matt is the project manager, and he's a project manager with the Learning Space Design Group at George Mason University. He's had 15 years experience, over 15 years experience of AV and IT. He doesn't look at it just like he's like 22 years old, but that's all right. Matthew holds the CTS certification. He also holds DMCD, which is Digital Media Designer for, and that's a Crestron thing? Yes, and he also has a PMP, the Project Management Professional Certification. He's contributed a lot to different things he does. He's a contributor to AV Technology magazine, right? You also do regular contributor to the podcasting for the, the AV Nation Podcasting Network. I think that's really impressive. He's a founding member, and I got to talk to him about this a little bit, but he's one of the founding members of the Virginia Classroom Technologies Group. So if you're not familiar with that, ask him about that. I think it's really, really neat what they're doing together, and I think it's a really good way that they collaborate. Matthew is also a moderator for the Infocom Task Group, developing the Infocom 10201X, which is the ANSI standard for the Audiovisual Systems Performance Certification or Verification. He's secretary for the board of directors of the Crestron Owners Group. Very good. And he's been active with CCUMC for a long time and also serves on our professional development committee. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Matt Silverman.
Thank you very much. Whoa. Is that a bit better? Oh, okay. Okay, well, wasn't trying to kill you there. Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you to UNLV, who's our host. This is a fantastic presenter setup. I really appreciate it. I'm here today to talk about a technology manager's modern-day survival guide. This is a really interesting presentation, and actually it came kind of from one of the groups that Simon mentioned. We have a group in Virginia called I guess we're calling ourselves the Virginia Classroom Technology Group, which is a group that started about 2 years ago, which came out of the folks who do what we do, audiovisual for classroom support, getting together at a statewide conference, and we weren't actually doing it voluntarily. Our CIOs forced us to. And we actually had a great conversation. And the conversation kept on going and going and going, and sooner enough, it's like 1 o'clock in the morning, we're still talking about what we do. And we realized it was time to start, sharing the knowledge and working together. And we started having 3 meetings a year, once per semester, where we get together. And one of the guys in our group, Matt McChesney, who's with Blue Ridge Community College, is in a really interesting role. And right before we started going with this group, Matt had been a computing guy, and all of a sudden he was told, congratulations, you're now the AV guy. And if we hadn't been there as a support network, he wouldn't have known what to do. And we love working with Matt and other people like him. So from that conversation, myself and 2 of the other guys started really talking about, well, maybe we should start doing a presentation on what it means from kind of a high level, and I'm saying this kind of from a manager, director type level, to start thinking about, okay, you're now responsible for AV, it's now your job. What does it mean, and what are some of the common pressure points? And so that's kind of what I'm here to talk about today. Technology is wonderful until it, yes. One last try. Okay, well, I tried to jack the presenter remote they had, but we'll go on just with, it's fine, Daryl, don't worry about it. No, I plugged yours into mine, and it's not, yeah, don't worry about it. So I appreciate it, though. So Simon gave a great introduction. One thing I did want to touch on, in my time doing this, I've actually pretty much, I think, done everything in audiovisual except for doing installation. Somehow I missed that step of my career, but I've been involved in the operations management. I'm currently involved in project management. I design systems. I even did event staging. So I'm trying to be kind of comprehensive on everything that's involved here. But it's one thing I think you'll find for those of us who've been in the profession for a while, you end up doing everything whether you like it or not. So it's good to have a good idea of both what you're doing today, but also particularly if you're going up in an organization, what's coming down the road for you. So as we get started, I want to kind of just do a quick hand poll just to get a little bit more information about who's out there and where you are in your career. So my first question is, about what experiential level are you at? So the people who are kind of in that 1 to 5 year, show hands. Okay, a couple of folks around the room. In the 5 to 15, good deal of the room. And more than 15. Okay, good deal of the room as well. Now here's the other big question. What do you consider yourself? Do you consider yourself an AV professional? Couple of hands. An IT professional? Couple more hands. Trick question, an AV and IT professional? And the last one, you consider yourself aligned with a different field. Okay, so a couple people, but would kind of say most of you consider yourself AV IT? Is that what, seeing some head nods? Sounds great. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. Defining the audiovisual profession. Something which has changed a lot in recent years, and we're going to talk about how to have that conversation with your administration. Projects and partners. We do them, we love them, maybe we don't love them, but people you're working with, architects, consultants, integrators, how we can work with those and make those relationships more meaningful. Technology and design. It's a lot of what we do. We're not going to actually get into technical stuff, but we're going to talk about how can you take a systematic approach to design and what are some of the big issues we're looking at with design, as well as also working with programmers. And external resources. What can you do, who can you reach out with, and how can you get value out of your community? So we're kind of going to start off with this first topic, which is defining the audiovisual professional. And this is actually a topic I'd love to talk about at length. I've started out actually myself on the IT side of the house. I was hired to do event scheduling, and we had like one computer and one projector. And then all of a sudden, AV got cheap. We stopped having the $20,000 projectors. We started having the $5,000 projectors. And that meant we could have 2 of them. And sooner or later, it started steamrolling, and we started actually doing staging in our multi-purpose room at the university, and we actually started getting to a little bit more complex setups. Not really the whole high-end, I'll say, ballroom or heavy audio reinforcement, but we started really expanding what we were doing. And there wasn't really this roadmap on how do you go from here or where do you go. And what I kind of found as I was working with people in my organization, this was their perception of what audiovisual was. And even today, I will say some of our senior administrators still perceive our profession as this. Is this what we do today? So let's talk about what AV looks like today. AV is really the glue in your classroom system, your administration system. It's how you get things to work together. We are integration professionals, which means we take a little of column A, little of column B, little of column C, D, E, F, E, et cetera. Keeps on going along. And if you start taking a look at a modern system, which I think all of us have started working with today, like lecture capture, you start looking that there's a lot more than even what used to be traditional AV. So you start with your lecture capture system, and you start with your presentation elements. Okay, this is where, when I started in the audiovisual profession, you had your computer, you had your projector, it was a presentation system. Well, you start getting into capture, and you start talking a little bit more, and you say, okay, well now I need some audio reinforcement, or I need some audio capture. I also need some video capture. So you start saying, well, there's a little bit more. All of a sudden you have to start thinking about things like acoustics, sight lines. Where do you put a camera? How about your lighting? Gee, they decided to downlight my screen. Love when they do that. And things like that, where you start saying, well, there's a little bit more, and it's maybe not just the system, it's also the environment that the system lives in. But wait, there's more. You move on to your next step. You start saying, well, gee, there's a little bit of control. I mean, I got this complex system. You get into a digital lecture capture system. You may have an 8x8 or a 16x16 or even a bigger router going on there. And you need a real easy way for the user to interface with the system. So you have to start thinking about, how do I put logic in there? How do things connect with each other? And really kind of make it work together, hence the integration. But we're still not done. Well, this is lecture capture, so you have to send the stuff over a network somewhere. I mean, it doesn't sit there. So you have to start playing with a little bit of the network. And oh, by the way, you now have a back end that you have to worry about. Where do you put your content? How do you manage your content? This is kind of a microcosm of where our profession has kind of exploded over the recent years. And we've gone from being just a simple presentation setup to being an integrated setup. What we see in this room alone, just to do this recording, is we have multi-point transmitters, we have a control system, we have a switcher, we have cameras, we have another back-end system running this. We have a mix. We have all this going into it. And it's not as simple as just what a lot of times the administration perceives as the overhead, or even 10 years ago, your computer and your projector. So as a professional, you sort of have to reframe the conversation and start looking at what is AV. One of the big challenges I've seen from a lot of people in our roles is an unwillingness to move from what I'll call a trade to a profession. And it's people who have been in the industry for a while. I remember how to converge a CRT projector, that really useful skill that we all need today. But we've had a lot of people on our staff who are unwilling to admit that the profession moved on, it's evolved, and you need some of the fundamentals. Converging taught you how to get a good image, but you don't set up this projector the same way you used to set up a 3-gun. So it's understanding things have evolved and trying to work on that discussion. You need to reframe this with your administration so they understand that what we're doing is as complex as IT. And in fact, it's a lot more complex, because if you look at most of your IT verticals, you have your networking group, who's your networking specialist. You have your server group, they're their server specialists. Do we get to specialize in anything? Not usually. We got to work with everyone and pull it all together. So as a technology manager, you really need to work at reframing that conversation and helping them understand how comprehensive the subject matter we're dealing with is. So this kind of moves into what skills do you need today, which are very different from where we've been historically, or maybe evolving, if you will. The biggest thing I'll say today that I would say for anyone who's trying to advance in audiovisual is get networking skills. Everything we do and everything we do in the future will ride on the network. It may be a private network, but it's the future. And if you can't converse with your networking group, you're going to be in trouble. I would actually recommend, it's something I've actually said to my boss, our director, that we need to get a number of our technicians trained up to the Cisco entry-level certification. It's not that I expect our people to be doing networking or that we will be managing our switches, but we need to be able to converse with our networking group in a language they understand and move the discussion from a demand to a set of requirements and go to them and say, here's what we need, and speak their language. And in the end, that will hopefully get you a better product and a better environment. But there's been a real communications barrier at times where we come, we say, we want to put this on the network. And they say, oh, no. And then they say, well, what does it mean? What's the security implications? And sometimes you have a vendor who knows what they're talking about. Sometimes you have a vendor who said, oh, there's no problem. And then you port scan and you find out the thing's wide open, never been patched, and your security administrator's just having fits. And it's one of these things that it's probably, in my opinion, the most important skill for us to start picking up in what we do. Digital video is the next one on the list, and I think everyone has either felt the pain, feeling the pain, or anticipating the pain of digital. You have new things like eDid, which just makes my life so much fun. In fact, when I came in here today, we ran into a little bit of a digital problem. I'm plugged in HDMI. It didn't work on the first try. And the funny thing is, and I and some of the guys I was doing troubleshooting with, our first intent was, okay, well, I'm getting EDIT information, so obviously I'm talking to it. I know my laptop works. It turns out it was a real low-tech solution. We were plugged into the wrong port on the back of the switcher. But that's one of the challenges we're seeing today with the digital environment. You could have a perfectly intact signal chain, and it doesn't work. And that's the right answer. Because if you have an HTTP violation or something in the chain, that can happen. So you need to start developing your staff in a way that they understand this. And they're thinking a little bit different, and they're thinking systematically. And they're doing component elimination. So you start with, well, I know this laptop works elsewhere. Okay, I know the cable works because I'm seeing EDIT information from the switcher. So it's probably something on the switcher. And so we hit the switcher and we're like, okay, well, let's start plugging ports. Sure enough, we find out we're just plugged into the wrong port. Mobile devices are also something which we're starting to get into and starting to see a lot of challenge. Sure, everyone loves supporting iPads on their campus. Don't you love how easily they just plug in and display? Or how about AirPlay with a corporate network? You know, isn't that fantastic? It's only going to get worse. There are at least 2 other AirPlay-like standards that I know which are going to get pushed. NVIDIA has signed up on something called Miracast, which is kind of Wi-Fi, if you've heard of Intel's WIDI, W-I-D-I. Miracast is kind of compatible with that. And all of a sudden, you're going to see this whole generation of Windows 8 tablets, which has an AirPlay-like function, but doesn't actually work in the same way AirPlay works. And you'll have people walking and saying, well, I want to present on this because really, what use is a mobile device where I have to be tethered? And it's going to be our big challenge, which is supporting this bring your own device community over the next couple years. And this is even going to grow more. So getting staff and getting staff training on what mobile devices and what do they mean. I throw computing in here, and I'm not sure for everyone's organizations where computing sits in the side of the house, but we interface with computing. And the computing guys love to say, it's the AV system's problem. So I'm not saying you have to get your guys up and certified on how to do computing. But the same way we need to be conversant on a network platform, we need to be conversant with computing people and say, okay, you know what? It's not us, it's you. You may want to try to update your drivers, and things like that. So you can actually have a good conversation. But a lot of times I've seen historically AV staff not wanting to touch the magic black box. And we need to demystify that and get them a lot more familiar and a lot more comfortable with moving in that direction. And the last thing is something I like to call systems thinking. And it's really the idea of understanding that a system is more than just what you see. And our systems are really expansive. You go back to the lecture capture example, your system includes your network, your back end, every interconnect. And you need to be tackling that in a systematic way if you're doing troubleshooting. Start eliminating things. Okay, again, this example, my laptop not working. Well, I knew this laptop worked, so the first thing I did was unplug the HDMI going into this one and plug it in there. And I said, well, gee, that proves my laptop works because it'll input on the same signal. Then we started looking at the ports, maybe that port's bad. It wasn't bad, it was just on the wrong port. But I've seen people on my staff chase their tails for hours on end because they're trying to tackle the entire system at the same time and not doing this in a logical, systematic way. So it's something as you start changing and start looking at our profession, part of what we need to be looking at and part of what we need to be changing. Any questions on this area? I'm happy to take questions as we go along. Anything on? Cool. Last thing I want to just say is we also have to realize, kind of like the CRT thing, when skills have depreciated. We have a lot of curmudgeons in the AV industry. In fact, I sometimes feel George Mason has singly employed all of them. But there are a lot of people who don't like change. We as technology managers have to know when the industry has moved on. And even if that sometimes means explaining it to the staff with a 2x4, helping them understand that just because you used to be the best CRT converger doesn't mean that skill holds relevance today. And we're going to see our rate of technology change get faster. In another workshop that I do, I kind of talk about the rate of change when I first started in the industry being about every 3 to 5 years. I currently think the rate of change in our industry is about every 18 months, that your products fundamentally start reinventing themselves. I think we're going to get down to about a year cycle in the next 2 to 3 years. I have no idea how we'll sustain that. I don't think it's possible for us to stay current, but we're being driven by the consumer side of the market. And the consumer side of the market's all about disposable equipment. So it'll be a big challenge for us as we go along to make sure we're current with what's going on, but also understanding certain things like our favorite friend, the VHS, just needs to be depreciated and put out to pasture after time. So the next section we're going to talk about is what I call projects and partners. Hopefully everyone has a chance or will have a chance at some point in their career to work on either a capital project or a major renovation or something like that. And it can be one of the most stressful times in an AV professional's life, because odds are the project's probably 75% done before they even figure about giving you a call. I've personally been in a very unique circumstance. George Mason has done about $1 billion worth of new construction and renovation in the past 10 years. So for the past 6 to 7 years, my entire life has been supporting capital builds or gut renovations. So this has become an area which is near and dear to my heart, and I'm hoping some of the things I've learned very painfully will be helpful to you as you approach projects at your institutions. Kind of when we start looking at this, you have to realize how significant a part of any project the audiovisual can be. I'm currently doing a science building at George Mason, which is a $50 to $55 million project. The audiovisual budget is, audiovisual and other educational technology is about $1.3 million. That's 3% of the project. And I saw a couple grimaces. We're actually very happy with that budget because we created it. It's based on our numbers. But we do run a little bit lean and mean on some of our stuff. But it's the idea is, even if you think that's a lean and mean number, that's still 3% of the project budget. I was talking to Jeremy from VCU the other day. He said, you have, what, $7 million out of, do you know how to tell a project budget? No. Okay. But $7.5 million, just the AV, on a School of Medicine building, which when actually you get into med schools, that's very typical. I know some people who've done that. There's a lot of, they'll put lecture capture everywhere. You get into operating theaters, you get into collaborative, and all of a sudden that number goes up way high. But you're actually a significant stakeholder. You know, at 3% of my project budget, I have a seat at the table. Now, I have a fantastic PM I'm working with from our facilities group who absolutely agrees with that statement, but that's not always the way it goes. And so here are some of the things that I just want to throw out to help people understand and get that seat at the table. Often they don't call you until design's done. Sometimes the walls are up and they're like, hey, we need technology. How are you going to do it? That's the wrong time to get involved. You need to get at the table as early as you can. There's a term, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, called programming on capital projects. The AIA actually has a phase they call focus, which is when you start actually going from a conceptual idea to something which is a written program for a building. That's when we need to be there. We need to understand what the users want and help the architect translate that into a usable space. Because, for example, say the user wants a screen this large, but then the architect says, hey, I'm going to be efficient in design, and I'll give you 8.5-foot ceilings. It'd be a little tough to get this in with an 8.5-foot ceiling, wouldn't it? So trying to get on board early is really helpful. One of the conversations we were having at the Quick Takes yesterday, we were talking about, there was a a table, I think it was on architects, which I think has become a 4-letter word in our profession. But one of the things that we talked about was how do you actually get at the table? And one of the things I'll recommend as a takeaway is find out who on your campus is responsible for planning. You generally will have someone in your facilities group who has a title something like campus planner. They're also probably affiliated with a group called SCUP, which is Society of College and University Planners. This is a group dedicated to professional society, very much like CCUMC, and they actually get involved with technology and everything, but they're involved with planning. If these are the people who know any project that's going on your campus, even when it's a twinkle in the president's eye. And one of the things I did as, in my university is I embedded myself in our facilities group. I actually got myself invited, sometimes forcibly, to their staff meetings. I started just sitting in on project meetings where I could, and everyone started knowing me. So anytime someone had a technology question, I'd say, yeah, I may not know the answer, but I'll be happy to field it or get you to the right person. 5 years later, they work with us on everything. Anytime they have a bizarro idea, I get a phone call. We were thinking about doing this. Okay, well, let's step back a sec. It's a really bad idea, but let's talk it through. And what that allows us to do is get in on the ground level whenever anything's going on. So if you're having a hard time getting a seat at the facilities table, go to SCUP's website, see if anyone from your university is involved. They have some presentations online, they do a lot of conferences. Find that person, then go become their new best friend. And that way you can hopefully get an inside line on what's coming down the pipe for your university. SCUP, SCUP. No problem. One of the specifics kind of going into this is working with architects. And again, as I said, we need to be involved with all aspects of design. One of the most important things you will learn with architects is if you didn't put it in writing, the conversation never happened. Never, and I'm going to actually, probably should have asked this, are there any architects in the room? Actually, let me just cover my basics. Architects, AV consultants, or AV integrators? Anyone? Okay, good, because I'm probably going to offend all the groups today, maybe some more, but just want to cover my bases. If it's on writing, it didn't happen on a project. And you'll learn that very fast the first time you walk into a room and say, gee, I could have sworn we talked about 11-foot ceilings, and by God, they're 9 feet. What happened there? And go to the architect. Well, we met on this day, we had this conversation. Well, I don't see it in the project record. It's not in my notes. It didn't happen. So the number one lesson I have learned from working with architects, put everything in writing, sometimes 4 or 5 times, and get used to forwarding back the same email. On one project, I sent the same email forwarded, I actually kept the chain, 7 times to the same individual to remind them, yes, we talked about this, and yes, they said they were going to make it happen. It took that level of just beating it into them to finally get them to make the change. But that's unfortunately pretty typical because an architect is dealing with every stakeholder on the project, and frankly, you're not the person who holds their contract. So that's the person you want to really put the pressure on, the person who can actually make them feel the financial pain. The other thing, which I'll say is when you walk in there, is trying to be a friend to the architect. At the same time saying beat them down, you also want to say, how can I make your job easier? They respond very well to that. So if you say, okay, we know this is a program requirement, got my program document right here, what can I do to help you design this room well? How can I help you? And they'll actually respond really well. Okay, well, I need this spec, this spec, this spec. No problem. Get it to them. But try to approach on that way and say, hey, we know you want to design a good building. You want this to go into your showcase, your portfolio. So we want it to be good too. Let's work together. And the thing that you always can point out with your facilities people or your architects is the technology will only function as good as the environment it is put in. If you have a horrible acoustical environment, you didn't have anyone actually work on it, it's going to suck. No amount of technology can fix bad acoustics. You can compensate for it, but you can't fix it. Same way with projection. If they give you what I call a bowling alley classroom, I'm not sure if anyone's ever got one of these, where it's about this wide and about yay long, you can't fix your sight lines. You can't change the laws of physics, no matter how hard you try. So hopefully if you can get this across to your design team, it'll help you with your overall process. So let's talk about the next group in the food chain, the AV consultants. This is an interesting breed of individuals. Let me ask you an odd question, but I'll throw this out here. Who's had a positive AV consulting experience? One. I'll actually say two. I've had one of many, but I've had a good set of consultants. Three. I hear this a lot. Technology managers are like, what are they adding to what value do they add? And it's really about how you define why they're on the project. You know, a consultant should be hired as a subject matter. A consultant should be hired as a subject matter expert. They're there to add value. They're there to augment a skill you don't have locally. So for example, if you're an institution like George Mason who handles their own AV system designs, I'm not going to hire someone to design my systems. Now, I hate doing CAD work. I don't want to do CAD work. I will gladly hire an AV consultant to do my drawings of record for me because it helps me with my process. But I'll tell them at the front end, guys, I don't want innovative, I want drawings. And that's what you're brought on for. So kind of just wanted to talk about some of the roles you can look at, and this is really what you need to define on the front end when you're hiring a consultant, and bring this back and talk to your facilities group, because I know often, and we run into this, we don't hire the consultant. It's usually part of the architect's bid package. And so we're dumped with someone. And here's the discussion, and it's all about the money. You tell them at the front end, if you let me get involved in writing the consultant's statement of work, odds are we will spend less money on the consultant because we won't hire them to do stuff we will already be doing in-house. What I hear all too often, I've heard this from a lot of schools in Virginia, is there'll be a consultant hired, the consultant will do, $50,000 worth of work. And the AV shop gets brought in after the work's done, and they'll say, we have standards, why did we do this? So you promptly take $50,000 worth of design work and put it in a dumpster. No one wants to waste that money. And if you talk to your facilities folks and say, really simple, I can save you money on the project. Because I have yet to be on a project where we're not trying to save money because we're not over budget. So some of the roles you can look at. If you're in an environment where you're a one-man AV shop, and this is your only capital building that you may do through the course of your organizational career, you may actually want to look at bringing a consultant on as an owner's representative. Because if you don't have local skill in managing construction teams or construction progress, this can be very daunting. And interview them, get some references, figure out who the right person is, but this can be a very valuable role. Right now I'm working with our libraries on their new library building. The university librarian has chosen not to take our services and go at it alone. We won't get into the local politics. I'm sure we all have moments like that at our own institutions. But we actually recommended, said, okay, you're going to go on it alone. We strongly recommend you hire an owner's representative for this project because you do not have the local talent to manage. In this room project will probably be 50 to 60 rooms of AV. You just don't have that talent. So hire someone, have them on the entire time to help you do that so what you get delivered at the end is what you want. Do a needs analysis. Figure out, you may even want to bring a consultant to help with that. If you're trying to figure out what should go into the building, have them facilitate the process. They're that neutral party that doesn't have a dog in the fight. Except for the fact, if you get involved and you hire them, they got your back. You may want to bring them in just to do the infrastructure piece. As you look at it, you say, okay, well, I don't really do conduit regularly. I don't understand how to do a conduit fill. I don't really want to do my CAD work like us. Bring them in to do that. You may be in a place where you want to do systems design. The other thing is procurement support. Say you don't do bids regularly. You want someone to write your scope document. That's another function. You shouldn't be looking, though, in my opinion, kind of on this whole contract. You got to figure out what makes sense for the project and specifically write a statement of work, which only gets you what you need. It'll save your institution money, which is always a good thing, and it'll just less headache because you won't have someone doing something that, frankly, you already plan to do yourself. Now, my next topic is probably the group that I'll defend the most, but it's the working with AV integrators. Quick show of hands, how many people do their own AV integration installations? Okay, what is it, about half the room? How many people solely do their own integration? They don't actually use integrators anymore? Got 2, 3, 4. I know there's a handful of people in Virginia. We're at about 2/3 of our installations, and the only reason we don't do 100% is bandwidth on non-capital and liability on capital installations. So kind of the way I look at it is an integrator's job is to install a system and move on to the next project. What did I just do? I killed it. That's interesting. Okay. So there we go. A technology manager's job is to support a system and its users for the lifetime of the system. Notice the conflict? The integrator wants to get you to say it's done and move on. They don't care if it works. They just want to get to done. You, on the other hand, own that problem for 5, 7, 10 years. So your job, your focus is get it done right. And I'll talk a little bit about this more, some of the commissioning stuff. Dan, who's actually sitting in the front row over there, well, on Sunday, I think, is doing a workshop, which I'd strongly encourage everyone to attend, on the commissioning process and some of this stuff. But it's one of the things to look at, which is having a much more structured relationship with your integrators as you use them. So a couple of hints on working with integrators. It's only going to be as good as your contractual documents. Notice I didn't say design documents. The work you receive will only be as good as the scope and the contract you write, where you hold them responsible for delivering what you asked. I would recommend, to some practices I do, I will not pay labor or any non-line item equipment costs until I have verified it 100% to my completion. It's amazing when you still owe them money, how readily they'll come back and fix your stuff. However, after you make that final payment, maybe they'll get to it whenever they have opportunity. So look at your contracting and do what your organization, your institution allows. I know a lot of them have different rules on when you can release funds for payment, but definitely try to put together something where you at least withhold payment, or if you're in a situation where you can do liquidated damages, definitely look at liquidated damages, because you're not going to get what you need until you make it hurt on their end. Make sure you get submittals on them. Even if you've designed your systems, even if your consultants have designed their systems, make them state back to you what they think they're installing. And then make sure you budget the time to review their submittals. I can't tell you how many times one of the firms I use has this teleworker dude they subcontract all their drawings to. He likes to go editorial on about 5% of our systems. For those who are not familiar with George Mason, we have a very rigid architecture. We have about 5 main designs. They don't change except about every 3 years. The same integrator installs them year after year after year for us. Every time we get submittals, he changes something on the same system. And I just do one of these, I'm like, you actually could have opened up the last CAD, changed the date, changed the project, resubmit it, we would have been awesome. But no, you had to add your flair. And it just, you could see the frustration. I'm trying very hard not to name him by name right now, but this has been part of my personal bane. But you got to make sure you check their work. You need to make sure they check their understanding. You need to commission your systems, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but again, Dan is going to have a great workshop on this. And the other thing, when you're all done, make sure they show you what they built. We all are familiar with the term called field engineering, right? Where it sounded great in practice, and then you go out there and you're like, okay, well, like the system. Okay, I plugged into 4 when I should have been plugged into 5 because 4 may have not worked properly or something like that. Make sure you get those drawings so you know what they actually installed and verify all the work happened. So these are just a couple of hints for working with integrators. Next section, kind of rolling in actually before I get finished. Any questions on the whole project or partners? Anything came up? Okay. So rolling into technology and design. This is a large part of our job, and it's actually becoming a much larger. Again, show of hands, how many people do in-house AV systems design? I'd say probably looking about 60+% of the room. This is becoming more and more, and my feeling is as we move forward, this will probably start approaching about 80% of us. Only the people who really just don't have the volume won't get into this because systems are becoming easier to design. The product is becoming more accessible. The internet has been very much a democratizing tool in the AV profession. You no longer need the secret keys access to find out what product's out there. So a couple thoughts on system design. First thing, systems design does not start with specifying product. Can't say this enough. You should not start walking in saying, I want this widget. Okay, you know what, Brian, you know my feelings on this. Brian's my Crestron rep, so I just, it should not start with specifying product. You have to have function, then you go to form. And you should really be starting with doing a needs analysis and gathering requirements from all your stakeholders. Meet with your faculty. Don't ask them what they want, ask them what they want to do. Start documenting, saying, hey, so what are you thinking about? Start blue sky and then start drilling in. Be honest about budget points. If they say, well, I want a video wall and I want lecture capture, and actually I want 2 video walls, one at the front, one at the back. You're probably going to have to rein them back, but at least you can start saying, well, okay, why do you want a video wall? Well, I want to have multiple images. Okay, that's a good point. Well, what if I gave you 2 projectors? Well, that would be better than 1 projector. They're happy. You've just saved, $100,000. And your faculty actually feels part of the conversation, part of the buy-in process. And you end up with a better design system at the end of the day because your users were involved in the process. When you get down to it, it should be the client, your end user, who should really own the functional piece. But then the support organization really needs the people who figure out the integration, figure out the form for it, what goes into it. And I'll use the term architecture. It really needs to exist within an overall organizational architecture. How many people here have like 7 different control systems or even 2 control manufacturers on campus? Got a couple of people. Isn't that a real bear that you have to? So I'm not going to endorse any product one way or the other here, but one of the things that I strongly recommend to everyone, and Jeremy and I are actually going to be talking about this a little bit more on Saturday in our Enterprise AV session, is that you really need to think about from the top down, what does your campus audiovisual architecture look like? Every product should make sense. You want to understand why it's in there and try to eliminate duplication if you can. So we now have our requirements, and one of the things I've heard a lot, I was actually talking to a couple of people I think yesterday about this, was I don't know where to get started with design. I've never designed an AV system. So I'm going to share with you something I use almost every day. I kind of call it my napkin CAD, but this is kind of how I start even before I get into real detailed systems. Really what I start with is what I'll call building blocks of a system. You have your video inputs, your audio inputs, the magic black box in the middle, your outputs, both audio and video, and then what I'll call your control layer, which is kind of what's going to go into it. So let's roll back for a second to that lecture capture system I was talking about at the beginning and talk about a little bit more, how would we drill into that. So the next step is I start identifying what are those inputs and outputs. And we start looking at that, and getting into it where there's a PC, doc cam, we have an aux video, an aux VGA, an aux HMI, and again, this is really going towards functionality. Just to let everyone know, slides will definitely be available. I saw some people doing some pictures, so if there's anything you see, you want it, I actually did this in Visio. I'm even happy to send you to Visio. I love to share this stuff, so just drop me a line afterwards. Just want to make sure everyone knew. But you kind of get into this and you start looking out a little bit more, and even you start thinking about like your audio design. Okay, well I know I'm going to want a lav mic, for the instructor to walk around. Well, maybe I'm thinking about this also, something we do in our recording rooms. We also put a boundary mic at the lectern, because I would say probably 1 in 3 instructors doesn't remember to mic themselves. And it's real interesting after watching an hour and a half of dead air with just a picture going. They really don't like that. So we actually, in a couple of our lecture capture rooms, just run a hot boundary mic. And it works really well. But, so we start getting into those design thoughts. What do you need? Also start looking into, again, this control layer. Well, I know I'm going to need a control processor. I know I'm going to need a DSP because I'm doing a little bit more complex stuff with audio. For the audio purist, I do personally consider a DSP a control piece, but that's just where I land. Touch panel, I do want some sort of interface. And on the output side, I start looking at what am I going to? Okay, I got a projector. I want a confidence monitor for program. I also want a second confidence monitor for their on-camera video. I got my lecture capture appliance. And then in this space, I'm going to say you have both program speakers. You also got some speech lift. And the one thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, is you also have your assistive listening in the design. If you aren't putting your assistive listening in every design, you need to be. How you deal with the ADA requirements, talk to your local person in charge of ADA compliance. But every drawing you do from here on forward, especially with the change that went in place in March of this year, you need to at least acknowledge that you're thinking about assistive listening in every system. So let's drill in one more level. Now the next thing I start doing is figuring out how is the system going to connect to each other. Again, haven't named a single product though. At this point, I probably have some products in the back of my head. Things like a PC. I know we have a standard PC in our architecture. I know I'm going to be going out on DVI-D. So I start saying, okay, that's my connectivity. I got a standard doc cam. Goes out on, actually that's DVI-I, but I know it's in there. I have a camera. Maybe I have a standard camera that has an SDI. I haven't even got into thinking about what my switcher is yet, or even how my IOs are going to work, but I now have a concept system. So I can start having further conversations. I know I want, a couple of mics. If you notice, like PC's on there twice, both as an audio and a video component. HDMI made this real tricky, and I've personally, when I do my drawings, I consider, while HDMI is AV, I draw it in my V column, because, well, I started more in the video side of the industry. That's just a personal preference. But when you start looking at the output side, you also have to think about your multiple, your output devices, like your lecture capture. Two things are going into it. That is not any particular product. I kind of just made that one up as far as input size. But you also have a couple of unknowns in there. Like, I know I need to support assistive listening. I don't know what it's going to be. So that question mark. For those of you who work with a lot of the major manufacturers, Crestron, Extron, I'm assuming AMX has as well, at this point, you have enough to have a conversation with one of the manufacturers and start talking about how do I build this system. And that's where a lot of people need to get. And I've, just even having conversations at the show already, people are saying, like, how do I get from I have an idea to design? I kind of use this napkin CAD. I can actually send this to a faculty member and say, hey, this is what I think I heard. Can you validate it? I can send it to my boss and say, this is the functionality we're going to have in this system. And we have not talked about a single piece of product. After I get a blessing on functionality, I then can either work the technology profile myself, or if I was using a consultant, I could hand this to a consultant and say, here's what we want, build it. I don't want all your expandability that every consultant loves to put in. I want that. Or you could, like I said, go directly to a manufacturer who has design support and say, hey, Here's my concept. What can you do for me? So this is a really easy way to take that function and translate it to a form. And hopefully you guys find this useful. It's something I've been doing for a while, and it really works on just about every level of interaction I do. As I mentioned, I wanted to hop on ADA just for a sec because, last question, is everyone familiar that there was a change to the ADA laws in March? Actually, I'm seeing a lot more nods than I usually do. So in March of this year, the ADA 2010 regulations went into effect, which governs pretty much everything in our environment. I'm not going to profess that I'm an expert on this, but I've got to the point where I need to know how to respond to it, and I want to talk about a couple things that people don't generally think about. We talked about assistive listening. Thing I will stress is if you haven't already had a conversation with whoever is the legally responsible person for making ADA decisions on your campus about assistive listening, you need to start that conversation. As I understand the new law, there is a requirement that any room which has any sort of, and it's no longer speech or anything like that, but any sort of amplified sound, I think is the actual term, requires installed assistive listening. Two things to know: you have absolutely no requirement to go back and modify. That ADA actually does not say you go back. The intention is every time you upgrade, you try to bring it to compliance. But it's a big change. There used to be a threshold based on the seating, and you need to have a strategy. I can't really tell you what it is, but you need to have a strategy with your ADA folks on how you're addressing this. The other thing which I'm going to throw out is universal design. This is actually a lectern that we've been working on. And I think this is actually what's going in. Pay no attention to the AV gear in there. We had the guy who's building the lectern just decide to throw random stuff in. We really don't know what he was thinking. But sorry, was there a question? Okay. But the lectern itself has actually kind of been a conversation in universal design. Some of the things that we hadn't thought of before, but we actually paid attention to, are reach distances. You'll see here up top, this is actually where we have a little tabletop I/O box where we have our auxiliary cables. We actually had to think about how far is it back. And we never actually thought about this far, because frankly our older designs were not actually compliant designs. This is actually the drill hole for our touch panel. So we had to think about where does the touch panel go and will they be able to reach it. The other thing we had to work on, this has actually been a big conversation for us lately, is lectern placement and where does it go. And what we ended up doing is really getting to conversations about how high should the lecterns be, how wide should the knee wells be, how much space needs to be around it. So if you haven't had these conversations with your ADA folks and your facilities folks, I'd strongly recommend having the conversation and try to have it on a positive note, as in you want to be part of the conversation, you want to be part of the solution, and it goes a long way. Because the last thing you want to hear is someone comes in and says, why does it look like this? And under some of the new laws, you're not actually allowed to do what we used to be able to do, which is swap rooms. There's more of an expectation of kind of universal accessibility. So embrace it, be involved with it. Don't ignore it. Because I know, and I'll say even early on in my profession, I said, it's not important. But as I started understanding this, it'll become more and more important. And if you ever end up with someone who's a litigious individual at your campus and loves dropping lawsuits on your university, which unfortunately happens more than you think, people do this because they can make money, which is not the right reason. The whole idea of the law is to make sure we're accessible. But there's a lot of people who, frankly, make careers out of suing people. And after you get involved with one of those, you'll realize it's much easier to address this on the front side than have to be involved in a response. So, just some thoughts on that. Next area I wanted to go into is talk about programming, and just kind of a little of comedy break. One of my favorite slides. And for all you copyright people, this is a Creative Commons license.
So for the geeks in the room, I just like to point out, Randall actually stated that the speak is for credit, my son.
So, just a little bit of humor there. But one of the biggest challenges I think we have as we've gotten more IT involved is working with our programmers, and specifically I'm talking about our AV systems programmers. And there's a couple of helpful hints that I'll throw out there as you're doing this. Well-defined requirements helps. If you can tell them what they need to build, they'll actually build it. However, if you say, well, I want a little bit of this and a little bit of that, they're going to try to divine what you want, but I can tell you as someone who's very techie, what makes sense to a programmer doesn't always make sense to the rest of the world. So they may meet what you stated, but if you didn't spell it out, it may not be what you wanted. The other thing which I'll get into when you're working as a system designer or a manager is you need to own the function of the system, but respect their technical process. Sometimes they need to try a couple things to get it right. Sometimes they need to work on it. Don't get in their process. We have a programmer, George Mason, who's very zen. And I've learned, and he's a phenomenal programmer, I hand him my requirements and I quietly walk away. And then I let him do his thing. I don't know what he does, but what comes out is awesome. So I don't know if I need to know, because at the end of the day, I get well-documented code and I get well-functioning code, and that's really what I care about. So as long as you're getting the deliverables you need, I really recommend don't get in their business too much. One of the other things where John, who's our programmer, often tells me, every time I ask for something complex, that's easy. When I ask him to do simple things, he starts pulling his hair out. A great example of this is my boss had a brainstorm that he wanted to start using our little 4-inch touch panels as digital signage. We'll not get into the merits of this, but it was a request and I had to honor it. So I went to John and I said, hey, John, what would it take when we're not inside, we haven't started up the room, to replace our logo with some sort of image? He said, oh, let me think about it. 2 hours later, he's like, there you go, it's ready to go. I'm like, right, never rolled out, never happened to it. I then asked him what I thought was a really simple question is, in our classrooms, we set a max level on our audio, and when it falls down to inaudible, we set that as a min so we don't have that whole bottom of your volume ramp, which is your kill ramping down to 0. And I said, well, occasionally you'll get a little system miss in there, so when we hit that bottom, can you just jump to a mute state, a 0 state? 2 months later, he had a solution for me. I now preference every simple question with his, I'm sorry I'm going to take up the next 2 weeks of your life. But I've learned that simple doesn't always mean easy, and complex from my point of view doesn't always mean difficult from programming. So think about that as you're working with them, and again, respect the process. The last thing I kind of want to point out on programming is, for those of you who work with programs that has a source code, I'm not saying you need to learn how to be a programmer, but learn how to read the code. Learn how to understand what's going on under the hood. Learn how to follow the logic. Get the code. Yes, I can't say that enough, and maybe it's because it's become so second nature. For us, actually, quick question here, how many people do in-house programming? Say about 50%. How many people do 100% in-house programming? Say probably about 20%. So for me, we've been doing completely in-house programming now for 4 or 5 years. It's second nature. But for those of you who outsource your programming, in every contract you state, you should be requesting uncompiled source code and every uncompiled module that you did. This is work for hire. I could care less what the integrator or independent programmer thinks. If you look on the IT side, people who write IT code, this is work for hire programming, pure and simple. That's my personal feeling on it, but Jeremy's absolutely right. Get the code. Jeremy?
One other comment on that. If you have multiple integrators, you're getting your code, it is good practice, though the code belongs to you, it's good practice to not pass it along to other integrators. Really keep that, that sounds like a duh, but some people may say, well, this is mine. I can do whatever I want to with it. Yes, you can, but there are ramifications. The next
One other thing I'll say on intellectual property, if you do write your own code, don't distribute uncompiled code. The reason I say this, and I've actually had this happen, we gave an integrator uncompiled code. They then sold that same system back to another department on campus, exact same system, except they changed a couple of the graphical elements, but we knew it was ours because, gee, our support number popped up when you hit the support button. They sold that back to the university and charged us for programming. Let's just say that one went pretty high up, had a long conversation with the CFO of that company, and I believe someone was actually fired over that incident, but you'd be surprised what goes on. So, as Jeremy said, intellectual property is very important when it comes to code, not just the program, you're outsourcing, but also your university property. And if you share code with other universities, where something George Mason will do on request, make sure you understand what that means. You have to put some sort of license on it when you share it, and you also want to put a statement about what liability you have. We'll send it out. We actually send our stuff out under a Creative Commons attribution non-commercial, which basically means any university can use it to their heart content. Don't hand it to anyone who's making money on it. And, I don't know what would happen if we actually had to get into an enforcement situation, but you don't really want to get there. So give some thought. The other thing which I'll say is the liability. You could write code which ends up bricking someone else's product, even though it works perfectly in your environment. Understand that you may have liability when you distribute, and that whoever's receiving it acknowledges that you're not warranting it works or does anything at all. So getting into the well-defined requirement category, I actually pulled this out of a project I did about 2 years ago when we moved over to digital and rolled out actually a new interface and a new touch panel. And this is just kind of an overview to give you an idea of how we've written programming requirements. I generally try to do it with a mock-up of the panel. I use Visio to do this. Color coding I found helps, so people actually see like different logical transport areas, or again, work, restaurant, shopping, if you're thinking restaurant. Those are also pages for those people doing pages. And really getting into talking about both what the button should do functionally, and I found no amount of detail, there's no way you can go overboard. It actually helps your programmers understand exactly what you intended. So I'll do things like I'll take screenshots of things I want them to emulate, or getting down to that level. But it just helps you get to a better product quicker. And you have a lot less stressed programmer, which is always a good thing. So this, again, will be available. If you want the full design document, just drop me a line. I'll be happy to send you the full design document. So talking about documentation, we've talked about a couple of these things before. There? This was actually done in 2010, before we got VHS. VHS got unceremoniously booted from campus this summer. My director, in a moment of rage, said it's gone, and it went away. So you take this interface. We're still actually using this interface. That's now just a blank button. And we've actually been looking at this as kind of a modular interface, so we can modify it when we do things. And I hope nothing ever replaces VHS, but say, that new format comes down the line, we can bring that into the same kind of look and feel. So yes, VHS is gone, but that's from 2010. So documentation. Couple of things to think about. Architectural and technical standards, things you publish. When I talk about architecture, I'm talking about audiovisual architecture here. For those who are not familiar, George Mason actually publishes our technical standards online for the world to see. If you need the link, let me know. I can get that to you. I would encourage everyone to be open about theirs, as open as your organization will let you. It's something which I think helps us as a community just share information and learn from each other. Design and facility standards. I think Dan's actually maybe talking a little bit about this in his presentation. But get involved with your facilities groups in writing, actual building, how high the room should be, what sort of conduit, what sort of power, and things you need there. Programming and Gui documentation, we just talked about those. And when you get into a project, there's 3 pieces of documentation I'd really recommend should be involved with every AV installation project. A scope document or a statement of work, depending if it's internal or external, but something which defines for everyone involved, including your internal team, what you expect to happen on this project. The second is a configuration document. How do you expect the AV system to be configured? And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a sec. And then the last one is a commissioning checklist. Coming in behind and saying, does the AV system perform to the scope that I set out at the beginning? George Mason uses two internal documents we have for configuration and for commissioning. And again, just let me know and I'll be happy to send these to folks. This is our configuration document for a DM 8x8 system. It's what's called our baseline system. It is approximately 40-odd pages, I think. It actually includes screenshots on how to configure every attribute of the system. This gets into things like setting EDID settings, how to set up the network, how to name things. The idea is it is done consistently every time the same way. And we can hand this to an integrator, we can hand this to one of our staff members, and they should get to the same point. Now I'll tell you, I don't have as much luck with our integrators, but I can tell you right now with our staff, I can guarantee it'll be what it needs to be at the end of the day. At the end of a project, we start with our commissioning documentation. This is really verifying functionality. This will depend what you need in your environment. The first thing you do in commissioning for us is verify configuration has actually been done. Then you start going into functional stuff. The number one thing we run into in commissioning is left-right speaker channel reversal. I don't know why, but I would say 50% of the projects that I commission, that is the only thing which is done wrong. And I'll take that every day of the week. But the whole idea is we have a process that we're actually verifying how things are wired, how it's performing. We do not verify our code as part of our commissioning process because our code is centrally managed. However, if you're doing rooms that are unique or you're rolling out new code, you'll actually want to go into detail as you're looking forward into this. Putting on one of the other hats that Simon mentioned, I'm actually the chair of Infocom's or the moderator of Infocom's task group for audiovisual system performance verification. We were actually working on an ANSI standard in this area. This is something that frankly, long overdue for the industry. And it's not going to be a prescriptive standard which tells you you must hit these values. But it's something which is going to provide you a framework to do this process and understand what you need to verify. As we've been working as our task group, we have actually found at this point, I think we have about 180 different verifiable items for audiovisual systems. And the idea is you kind of look at that universe of 180 items and figure out what applies to your project. And I know it sounds a lot, but if you start doing this, it actually comes together pretty quickly. But when you work in commissioning, you should have commissioning in mind as soon as the project starts. So you start defining what does the end look like, because your commissioning process is really verifying at the end of a project you got what you asked for. That's from internal staff, from integrators, from consultants, from whoever. So if you're not doing commissioning right now, it's something I definitely think about. You'll be hearing a lot more actually from Infocom on this over the next 6 months, and also, like I said, Dan's going to be talking about this. Mario Maltese is also going to be here talking about this. Mario is part of a group, and I'm going to probably mess up, AQAV, which is actually looking at even a higher level, which gets to quality management, which is kind of the idea of zero defects and having a consistent process throughout. For people who are familiar with ISO 9000, it's very much in that school of thought. It's the zero defects, total quality management type of perspective. But these are things that you'll start seeing more and more in our industry, so it's things I strongly recommend people start thinking of. So really pushed out a lot of stuff so far. So the last section we have is what I'll call external resources, which is where do we go for help? And you guys have made the first right choice. You're here. That's fantastic, because a lot of our colleagues don't understand there's other people they can reach out for help. So a couple of things to look at. These are just a couple of peer-to-peer resources that I would recommend. Conferences, listservs, online groups, social media, site visits. You all have an invitation to visit George Mason anytime. please let me know. I'd be happy to facilitate a tour if you want to. I found when I go and visit people, it's very helpful because it makes me think about my environment. So use your peers. What I like to say is crowdsource your problems. I can't tell you how many times I posted something to CCUMC's list or AV1 and said, I don't know how to do this, or I need a product that does this. Anyone have an idea? Solved a major problem. I was trying to find a little confidence monitor for one of my video conferencing rooms. Had no clue. I don't really deal in this space. 2 hours later, I had like 70 suggestions. And it was awesome. So I was able to go through and say, okay, this one works. Thank the list, and we were able to get our project. If I had to research that, I probably would have spent 2 or 3 days looking through everyone's product catalogs. So you use these resources. There's a lot of us. I'm one of the people. I like to solve problems. You throw something up on the listserv, I just like to respond to them. I mean, I actually think it's fun to kind of think these things through. So something to think about. The other thing which I'll throw out is what I call manufacturers the hidden resource. I don't know why, but a lot of people seem to be afraid of, I don't want to say getting in bed, but really getting to know their manufacturers. And you got to realize these are people, if you've already adopted their product, their entire goal is to sell you more. So they want to keep you happy. Once we get into some of these systems, you get into proprietary programming languages, you get into really odd custom environments. So the person who's going to know it best is the people who built the box. Get to know them. There's a lot of phenomenal manufacturer training out there. And if you need more, talk to your reps. Tell them to come on site. Most of the major companies, projector manufacturers and control, have educational rep programs. Get to know your educational reps. Most of them, all they do is support higher ed. And one of the things they can help you do is you're having a problem or you're trying to think of something, ask them if someone else in their territory is doing that same thing. And they may be able to make that connection for you. The other thing which I'll say, and most people don't realize this, is for some of the smaller companies, there's something called an independent rep. How many people are familiar with independent reps? Just a couple people. Independent reps are people who carry a whole line card of products, except they can't sell you anything. Their entire job is to get information out about some of these smaller companies. And I'm going to guess in probably any market, there's probably 4 or 5 independent reps who are the major players. And they will cover probably between the 4 or 5, 100 products among them. If you need that niche product, I mean, some of these companies, I mean, they may run 1,000 units a year. That's their entire production run. This is where you'll get independent reps and benefits. But they also rep some of the major people, like mount manufacturers or infrastructure pieces, which it's just not as efficient for them to have a dedicated rep for a section. So find your independent reps and get to know them. Because odds are they may be able to help you out with something when you need that really weird thing, like I needed a special mount. And I just went to my independent rep and said, okay, I know you have actually 3 different people who make mounts on your line card. I need one of these. What are my options? And he literally came back with 2 products from 2 different vendors, said, well, this one will work or this one will work. And I ended up finding one. But again, it saved me the time because these are people the companies pay to rep their product, but they don't sell anything, they don't make a commission. So you're not going to get the same slimy sales that you'll get if you go to your integrator, and he'll say, oh yeah, that's my spiff of the week. Got one of these right for you, So yeah, they care about just aligning product with customers. Their goal isn't necessarily to get the margin. So that's a resource which I think at times is underutilized, and I'd strongly encourage everyone to use that. So we're actually doing pretty well on timing, and I'm kind of wrapping up at the end, but got one more thing. So today I am launching a new site which I hope everyone's going to find useful. It's called the AV Body of Knowledge, and this actually came out of last year's CCUMC. I was doing the digital presentation, and people said, where do you get your resources? And I'm like, well, I got a whole bunch of them. And I said, I'll send something out to the listserv. And time went by, and we all know how that goes, and nothing kind of happened. So what this website is, and let's see how well this works. Something about a live demo is always interesting. So it's avbach.com. We just kicked this off. I'm going to do a kind of a wire launch in later in the month with AV Week. But this is a human-curated body of knowledge where the idea is to get you linked to resources that help you do your job. We have about 100 things in here right now, and we're trying to add more as we can. These are the different groups, and boy, I didn't realize how difficult this would be to navigate from here. But if you drill in, and I'm just picking one, there's organizations, what you're going to have is just a link to the website, and the goal is to get you to something which will help you do your job. One of the things which I think hopefully you'll find the most useful, and this is really not working well. Excuse me a sec. Is Design Guidelines for Higher Education. This is actually a resource that I've just been putting together over the years. And these are different universities who make either their facilities designs or their systems designs publicly accessible on the web. This is going to be an evolving resource. We also on the front page have a human-curated news feed. It's an RSS feed if you're looking for stuff in the AV. Right now, myself and B. Bagby from Virginia Western Community College are doing that. I'll definitely say I'll ask you if you're interested in participating in two ways. If you're interested in becoming a curator, more is the merrier. This is about increasing the body of knowledge. Or if you just have a link we think we should have in here, there's a submit button. You can just hit it, send a link, and we'll get it added. So right now, like I said, there's about 100. I really hope to grow this over time and just kind of make this a place, if you need to find something, it's a resource for you. So that's what we got. Sorry about leaning over the mic. And find my mouse. So okay, so this is my contact information. That's everything I got. I'll be happy to take questions. So thank you very much. No sponsorship. It's something I started myself, something I actually want to keep as a non-commercial project. It's really something I truly believe in, which is open knowledge. And after doing this for 15 years, I've personally found it very hard to find a consolidated source, particularly in the audiovisual field. So it's just something I'm personally passionate about. Yeah, that's where it is. No sponsorship, and I really hope never to have to get to that point. No problem.
Hi, at the very beginning, you were talking about training your staff or always retraining your staff. On networking, do you have any recommendations for training your staff? Resources to train them?
It's expensive, but I
Yeah.
would personally look at it, depending on how large your staff is or, and how large your environment is, getting one or more people to a CCENT level, which is a Cisco certified entry level technician. I'm probably getting that wrong, but it's basically, if you send them to the official training, it's probably a $4,000 to $5,000 training investment plus the certification cost. But I'm assuming most of us are living in Cisco environments, and what it means is you get someone who talks networking. And again, I don't recommend getting into the networking business, but it's getting someone who can basically speak their language.
Thank you.
No problem. Anything else?
I'm really excited about all the stuff that you've done here, and your organization is just impeccable, and it's really inspiring to watch your talk. But at the beginning, you talked about doing your budget for this big project, and you said, oh, it's 3% of the budget. I immediately went in my calculator for our last big multi-million-dollar project, and I was like, wow, we budgeted 2.5%, but we should have budgeted 3%. I'm just wondering and asking everybody in the room, does this seem like it's a good rule of thumb going forward for a big project, this 3% of the budget for AV?
That was a completely arbitrary 3%. My budget actually wasn't 3%. I actually did a room-by-room analysis based on program and submitted a budget to our facilities group. On this project, it just so happened to be 3%. I've had other projects where I could have been as high as 5 to 7%. And, you know, as Jeremy's example, the med school, my guess is they may be as high as 10%, if not more, with the $7.5 million number. What I'd recommend on budgeting is, again, if you can get involved in that program state, have them list each room and then figure out a dollar figure to go on that room. I can tell you right now, I am never right on an individual room level, but I've always found that in a project at an aggregate level, it'll roll up and correct itself. And make sure you're honest and you add buffer. For example, the project's 5 years down the line, add 10%. You know your costs are going to go up, or you add more than that. Work with your facilities people. They actually have escalators that they use to figure this out. But always be honest when you add your buffer. And at least for me, my numbers are impeccable, so I hand them. Facilities may say, you know, ask a couple questions, but it's actually not about the numbers anymore. It's about how did I determine that number went with that room. And you just want to build that relationship, and you just have to get a few successes, and then they'll know, you know, that works. No problem. Any other questions? Okay, well.
If there are no more questions, again, I want to thank everybody for attending, and let's just give Matt another round of applause. He's a great guy and willing to share everything. Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you.